Hello, I'm David McNally. I'm Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Houston. I'm a strong supporter of the movement for Black Lives and of the scholar strike, which is taking place right now as scholars, teachers, educators across the United States and in Canada express their solidarity with the movement against racial injustice and police violence. I want to make a few reflections on the significance of this moment in terms of my own expertise as a historian of racial capitalism and of social movements. And I'll begin with an observation by a 20th century philosopher who said that one of the most difficult things for all of us is to understand the present as history. We tend to think of history as having to do with the past. But in fact, we are making history right now. History is being made by millions of people, particularly in the United States right now, who are at long last taking up the banner of an end to all forms of racial oppression and violence. This is a historical moment of immense significance. And as a historian of social movements, I'd like to say a little bit about its magnitude and its importance. Since the execution of George Floyd by members of the Minneapolis Police Department in May, there have been in this country over 7,750 protests. That's as of August 22nd. These have taken place at more than 2,500 different locations, cities, towns, and villages across the United States. Something in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 million people have probably participated in some kind of action in defense of Black lives and against police violence. This makes it the largest protest movement in American history, larger than the Civil Rights Movement, larger than the anti-Vietnam War movement. And of course, part of its great significance today is that it is the most multiracial movement against racial oppression in the United States that we have ever seen. This truly gives it an importance, the likes of which we haven't seen, because it speaks to an uprising of millions of people of many racial and ethnic backgrounds in the United States against racial injustice. It's, in other words, a societal awakening. And of course, it is a Black-led movement in all of its important registers, but it is nevertheless a multiracial Black-led movement. For all of these reasons, it represents also a tremendous opportunity to dramatically transform all of the social relations that need to be addressed in the United States today, because it is a movement for both racial and social justice. Social justice in housing, in employment, in healthcare, and so on is intimately connected to any defense of Black lives today and to any movement against racial injustice and oppression. Now, in talking about the significance of this movement, I also want to pause and say something about the way in which some forces in our society have tried to associate it with violence. Now, every mass social movement is going to have episodes in which anger against oppression boil over. This is inevitable in a society which has mistreated people, including murdering them, as is the case with, for instance, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. But we need to remind ourselves that the most detailed study of this protest movement, which has now been going on for more than 3 months, its most detailed analysts tell us that 93% of all of the protests have been peaceful. This comes from a study by the Armed Conflict, Location, and Event Data Project. 93% of the protests in the United States since May 26th have been peaceful. Violence has overwhelmingly been a result of police actions, tear gassing, beatings, mass arrests, use of rubber bullets, and so on, or it has been a result of white supremacist violence, driving cars into demonstrations, shooting at demonstrators, and so on. It's also the case that historically, those trying to defend white supremacy have used claims about violence against movements for racial justice. The claim was regularly made that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was violent because when it was attacked, people peacefully resisted as best they could these kinds of attacks on the demonstrations. I want finally to turn to the responsibilities first of educators, but then of every single one of us who believes in this movement, this transformative campaign for racial and social justice in the United States. Because educators are committed to the pursuit of truth, but we also know that truth is inseparable from freedom and from justice. And so as educators, we are not just committed to intellectual truth, we are committed to true values, to societies which unfold in ways designed to maximize the liberty, the opportunities, the well-being of the majority of its citizens. And so it is a responsibility of us as educators today to say we stand in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. We recognize it as a historical movement which is on the verge of initiating years and years of societal change for truth, for justice, and for freedom. And so I lend my voice and my solidarity to that movement today, and I hope that all of us will continue to reach out and to make it clear that freedom, truth, and justice are on the side of the oppressed and on the side of this struggle. And that's why we must begin and end so much of our work today